Hello and welcome to the Christ Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. This is Matthew Best. I serve as pastor of Christ Lutheran Church in Allison Hill in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Thanks for being here. If today's message connects with you and what you're going through, brings you inspiration, or offers connection with God, I ask you to please stay on after the message for just a few moments to learn ways to connect with the congregation and the health ministries that we offer. And now, let's dive into God's Word. A reading from the book of Daniel, chapter 2. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will give the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought David before the king, and said to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who can tell the king the interpretation. The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to tell me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king, No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or diviners can show to the king the mystery that the king is asking. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has disclosed to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen at the end of days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in the bed were these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be hereafter, and the revealer of mysteries disclosed to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me because of any wisdom that I have more than any other living being, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. You were looking, O king, and lo, there was a great statue. This statue was huge, its brilliance extraordinary. It was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of that statue was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked on, a stone was cut out, not by human hands, and it struck the statue at its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, into whose hands he has given human beings wherever they live, the wild animals of the field and the birds of the air, and whom he has established as ruler over all. You are the head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and yet a third kingdom of bronze shall rule over the whole earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. Just as iron crushes and smashes everything, it shall crush and shatter all these. As you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the strength of iron shall be in it, as you saw the iron mixed with clay. As the toes of the feet were part iron and part clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with clay, so will they mix with one another in marriage. But they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall this kingdom be left to another people. It shall crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has informed the king what shall be hereafter. The dream is certain, and its interpretation trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, worshipped Daniel, and commanded that a grain offering and incense be offered to him. The king said to Daniel, Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have made able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel, gave him many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I'm wondering if you have ever seen pictures of or heard of the cathedral in Cologne, Germany. It's kind of, John, you have. Yeah, you've been there. And it's an impressive structure, isn't it? It was still partly being worked on. Yes. Yeah, they've been doing restoration since the 1950s. So it's 2024. That sounds like a long time, 70 some odd years. So let me give you just a short, brief history of the cathedral in Cologne. It's this magnificent structure. It's really tall. It's beautiful, very Gothic in style, right? So it was started in 1248. 1248, okay, in Cologne, and it was commissioned to house the relics of the three wise men, which were believed to have been brought to Cologne in the early 12th century. So the supposed three wise men, somehow they found some stuff that belonged to the three wise men, and it ended up, and this was very popular in the Middle Ages, of collecting stuff from important theological figures, right? And they would venerate them. And this is part of what Luther was trying to correct in this. No different than what I was just showing you of like, oh, I've got a bone of whoever and supposedly has special powers and all that. No. But this is why the cathedral was started in 1248. So there was some initial phases of construction that kept going until 1560. 1248 to 1560, and it wasn't done. 300 plus years, not done. This church goes back to 1890. That's not even half the age of the initial phase of construction in Cologne of the cathedral. So it stopped because there were wars, there were financial difficulties, there was changing in architectural tastes. It just stopped. And it stopped until 1842. It's when construction picked up again, because there was an interest in completing it. And so they completed it in 1880. 1248, when it started, 1880 is when it was completed. That's over 600 years. That's a major building project. And we think we're waiting a long time to get, restoration on the bell tower, and it's like taking us a couple years, right? I hope it doesn't take 600 years. Over 600 years. I went online and I was like, I wonder how many generations that is. There's an app for that, of course, right? 21 generations. 21 generations. 600 years. That's longer than what Exodus says that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Just to give you some reference. Imagine the change that happens over 600 years. It would take far too long to go through. 1248 was far different than 1880 in every way that you can imagine. Nations had come and gone. Technology had changed. Styles changed. All languages had changed. Religions and everything. Amazing. 600 years. And then, of course, like I said, the restoration started in the 1950s and it continues on to this day. So really, this is an ongoing, never-ending project, if you want to think about this. Yeah?
I heard a similar thing up in New York. That's a similar thing, John.
Oh, yeah.
It's always on.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Absolutely. We can talk about this in the sense of the long view versus the short view. That's the point of this. The long view is strategic. The long view is deliberate. It's intentional. It knows there are going to be setbacks and stoppages and wars and famines and destruction and just stuff is going to happen. The short view is immediate. It's concerned with wins. It only looks at the current situation. In some ways, our election system is very much like this. Everyone's concerned about getting to November. What happens after that? We still got to live. We still got to exist together in some way, shape, or form, and I don't know what that's going to look like, but the long view, it's not just about what's coming up, but the long view. God has always been concerned with the long view. It doesn't mean that the short term is not important, but the short term doesn't determine everything going forward. It's the long view. God takes the long view. I had read something that talked about the idea of faith is the ability to see something that isn't yet. It's a vision of something that isn't yet, but is coming. Which brings us into Daniel. And I want to give you a little context with Daniel, and then we're going to talk about the story, because I think it's really important. Daniel is one of those books that is, like Revelation, gets misunderstood in a lot of different ways. It gets used and twisted for people's own agendas and all this type of stuff. The book of Daniel is the only book in the Old Testament that we know within 3 years of when it was written, between 167 and 164 BC. That's amazing. All the rest of the Old Testament, we have no idea when it's written. You have an idea of, there's Isaiah's written at 3 different portions and all this, but Daniel, we know because of events at that time. And Daniel is a parable. Daniel is not the literal story of Daniel. It's written well after the time period in which the story takes place. Why is it written then? Let me tell you what's going on in 167, 164. There's the Seleucid Empire, which came about after Alexander the Great conquered a great portion of the known earth at that time. And he dies young, and his kingdom is split into 4 parts, and one of those is the Seleucid Empire. And the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in Egypt battled back and forth with each other, and Israel goes back and forth multiple times. And it ends up that the Seleucids are in charge. And the emperor of the Seleucid Empire during that time period is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. There's a name for you. Say that 5 times fast, right? He is a narcissist. He sees himself as divine. And he goes to Jerusalem, to the temple, and he sacrifices a pig to Zeus in the Holy of Holies. How do you think that goes over? Not very well. That's a nice way to put it. It's the sacrilege of the desecration of the temple that is talked about in other places of Scripture. It's a historical event that actually took place. And he does this to mock the Jews and their God because the Seleucids have conquered the Jews. And so obviously their God is weak and they are conquered and oppressed. And the Jews have gone through this before many times, that they have been conquered and oppressed. It's after 164, and this is why we know 164, that if you're familiar with the story of Hanukkah, the actual story of Hanukkah, what happens is there's an uprising because of the slaughter of a pig in the temple, the desecration of the temple. An uprising happens, and they throw off the Seleucid Empire. And to make the place holy again, they light candles, but they only have oil for 1 day, but it lasts for 8. The story of Hanukkah. This is what happens immediately after the time in which the book of Daniel is written. There's your context. So it's not so much about Daniel, it's about the people who are living under oppression, who are forced to do things that they don't want to do. Daniel, as you heard in this story, is given a different name, Belteshazzar. As I mentioned in the Bible study, anytime that you see a Hebrew name that ends with E-L, it means of God. Daniel, something of God. Raphael, of God. Michael, of God. Joel, of God. And the Babylonians have no interest in that, and they change names to their gods. They are completely trying to wipe out everything Jewish because they conquered them. This is what empires do. Empires have no room for other ways of doing things. Empires cannot be satisfied. There's never enough. Empires kill, they destroy, they oppress, and they exploit. That is the history of empires. And it's never enough. They're never satisfied. They see themselves as God. And what the book of Daniel does is it provides comfort to people who are oppressed. It gives them hope. It says, God has a long-term view. That stuff is going to happen. There's going to be setbacks. And yet, God is in charge, not empires, not kings. Right before this section of Scripture, Daniel has this wonderful song that he does in which he talks about the God of Israel as a God who raises up and brings down kingdoms and kings. It is God who does. It's God who is powerful. It is God who determines what will happen. It's not the empires. It's not the power of the sword. It's the power of God, the power of love that determines what will happen ultimately. It's not a short-term view, it's a long-term view. It's the same story with the Exodus story, 400 years. And we think, my gosh, that's beyond our lifetime. Yes. God has the longer-term view. The Israelites would be in captivity in Babylon for over a generation, 70 some odd years. And then they would be conquered. When you go through this and you hear about the statue, it's naming empires. It's starting with Nebuchadnezzar, you're the gold head, the standard bearer of what kingdoms will be. This is Daniel kind of pumping up Nebuchadnezzar, who's a narcissist. Remember, what's written here is really all the kings that we're going to hear about in Daniel are really about Antiochus Epiphanes. You're going to see that they are ultimately powerless, that they're ridiculous and over the top, that they're cruel. That's who he was. So the top of the statue is Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom in Babylon. And then we hear the next section down is silver. It's not quite as good. So that's the Media-Persia Empire that we're going to hear about in there. Cyrus of Persia in there. And then you're going to go down and you're going to get the bronze that covers the earth. That's a reference to Alexander the Great. And then you have an iron. And iron is the Roman Empire. And then the feet are iron mixed with clay. That's the breakup of the Roman Empire. It gets split into two parts and it collapses. So this is written right before the Roman Empire takes over but is on the rise. This is what's going on. The story is about a dream of the statue, but it's really about empires and how God prevails. The long view. It's about God's vision for God's people. When I thought about this in terms of, Abby had asked me, she said, so what's this mean for people in their practical lives? Abby's always good about keeping me, I get excited about all the history and everything. She's like, get to the point. Okay. So what does this mean for us in our lives? Because empires are huge, right? And we think, well, what are we going to do about this? The empires that we face, whether we're talking about actual military empires or cultural empires or whatever empires that exist, they exist in a lot of different ways. Things that think that they have rule and control over us. I thought about this in terms of what's going on here is a dream. And God speaks through a dream to Nebuchadnezzar, who thinks he's all powerful, but he's not. But God has a vision. God has a vision of what will be. And Scripture is going to lay out a whole lot of visions of what God has in store, this long view. In this case, it's that empires are going to fall. And in its place, a mountain will be in its place. And think about what the mountain provides, this view over all of the land. A mountain is where the source of water usually comes from. A mountain has vegetation and is a place for animals, a safety, those type of things. Much more unified in that way. So I started to think about, well, what are some other famous visions, dreams? I think there's no other famous one that we can think of than MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., who literally had a speech about, I have a dream, in which he expresses the idea of the beloved community. And what will that look like? And I'm just going to read a short little bit of it, because it's powerful. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering in the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. And of course, he paints this beautiful picture and goes on in so many different ways of what the beloved community is, what God's vision of the beloved community is. And so I had started off with the question of what is God's vision for this community for Allison Hill, but I changed it. I changed it to God has a vision for this community and for Allison Hill. God has a vision, just as God has had a vision to share with Daniel, to share with King Nebuchadnezzar, and for the people of Israel who were under occupation. God had a vision of what would happen, is that they would be set free. Just as God gave a vision to Isaiah when the people would be coming back from Babylon, and a road would open in the desert, a way would be made for them to come back to the land that they were promised. And it would be flowing with milk and honey. Just as God had a vision for the people of Israel when they were enslaved in Egypt, and God opened up a path for them to come to where God wanted them to go. God has a vision for this community. I've had lots of conversations with folks over the last couple of weeks about that very notion. It's interesting. People see what goes on. We see what goes on around us. You all know the story. There are gunshots literally outside of the walls of this church. There's drug issues. There's prostitution. Every day a police car comes by. That's what we see with our eyes. The question is, what is God doing in the midst of setbacks? What is God's long vision, the long view for this community? It goes beyond any of those things that make us feel horrible, unsafe, whatever the words we want to say. God is up to something, and it's long term, and it goes beyond our very lifetimes. That can be frustrating because we want to see progress. We want to see things change. The long view. God has been doing this for a long time. I've shared this before. Just since 2018, over 100,000 people have set foot in this building. 100,000 visits. If that's not long view, I don't know what is. Think of the healing that goes on. There's plenty of hurt, but think of the healing that happens 100,000 times. Whether people are coming to the clinics, whether they're coming to gather the Spirit or Power to the Hill or coming to worship, there is healing that is happening right here. literally where we're all sitting and standing, there's healing. And that's part of the long view of God. There's changes that happen. I remember coming up here, 7 years ago, because at that point, I was in my first call, and we were doing some ministry at the local truck stop with people who were homeless. And I came here because I knew about the clinics and all that, and Drew had given me a tour, and I remember the neighborhood looked different. There's been improvements. There's been restaurants that have opened. There's been some investment in buildings. There's been changes. One of the local pastors, Josiah from over the Brethren Church, said that he had a group of folks, and he walks around the neighborhood and all that, and he often has heard about, there's trash, there's this, that, and the other thing. And he said what was amazing to him was they said, wow, I didn't know that there were so many restaurants and businesses, and that people were nice to each other and cared about one another. He was dumbfounded. He didn't know what to say to that because no one had said that to him. This is part of the long view of what God is up to. It's a slow process. It's deliberate. It's intentional. It knows that there's going to be setbacks, and yet it continues to persist. The book of Daniel is a message of persistence, that God will not be stopped. God will not be stopped. The power of love is not impatient. Violence is an impatient way to go. But God's love is not impatient. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is enduring. It does not force its way, as we hear Paul write in 1 Corinthians 13. God's way is the long view. And God invites us to see that long view. As we go through these next few weeks, through the book of Daniel, we'll see God's long view. We'll see the emperor want to stay in the short view, and empires want that because they're concerned about winning. But God is concerned with something so much better, so much more transformational. And that's what we're participating in. Thanks be to God. Thank you again for listening to the Sermon Podcast. I'm always happy to have a conversation or pray with you. Please reach out either by email to pastor@christharrisburg.org or call me at 717-236-8382. I'd also invite you to be part of worship on Sunday mornings at 10:30 a.m. We're a very diverse, open, affirming, and laid-back congregation. Christ Lutheran Church is located at 124 South 13th Street in Harrisburg. Parking is along the street. You can enter the building through the side entrance on South 13th Street or at the corner of 13th and Thompson Streets. And lastly, check us out on the web. Our website is christharrisburg.org. There you can learn more about and offer your support for the congregation, as well as the health ministries and free clinics that we provide to people in need in our neighborhood. I invite you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, also at Christ Lutheran Harrisburg. Thank you. I look forward to connecting with you, and I pray that you have a blessed week.